All right. Good evening, everybody. If you don't know me already, my name is Megan Smith-Fajardo. I'm going to be leading us through the introduction into our policy problem today. And after I set up the policy problem, my colleagues Colin, Tim, and Christine are going to be presenting their policy solutions. So today we're going to be talking about EV infrastructure in rural California. So getting started, I want to acknowledge our client, Robert Burris. He's not in the room right now, but I imagine he will be in a few minutes. Bob is the Deputy Chief Economic Development Officer of the Rural County Representatives of California, or the RCRC for short. And Bob was really crucial in developing our both the frame of our problem, but also our criteria and some of our solutions as well. I also want to highlight the Eightfold Path by Eugene Bardock and Eric Potashnik. As many of you know, this is the framework for which we really use to set up our entire project. So this was from their book, Practical Guide to Policy Analysis. And I won't go through the entire thing, but this is really the frame that we are basing our entire project on. So the first step is defining the problem. And our problem is that rural California counties have too few resources and too many barriers to build adequate publicly available EV infrastructure in California. And the reason we feel this is a problem is because in 2020, Governor Gavin Newsom signed an executive order stating that by 2035, all new car sales in California have to be zero emission vehicles. And so when we're considering rural counties, we really need to make sure that they have the infrastructure to support EVs so that they can meet this mandate. There's a lot of ways to define rural, but for our purposes, we're going to be defining it as the counties that the RCRC represents. And you can see those counties up here in this map and as well as listed on the side. So to understand EV technology, we really need to start with the types of charging stations. So there are public stations, shared private stations, and private stations. Private stations are what they sound like. They're individually owned. They're meant for one car or one person. These are typically in people's homes. Shared private is something that multiple people use, but it's not open to everyone. So you might think like your workplace, if you have a EV infrastructure there that everyone who works there can access, but the public in general cannot access, that is a shared private charging station. And then there are public charging stations. So the public charging stations are really what we're going to be focusing on. These don't necessarily mean owned by the public, just publicly accessible. So anybody driving by could stop and plug into them. There are also three different types of actual charging station or actual chargers. You have level 1, level 2, and direct current DC fast chargers. So level 1 are the slowest to charge. They also take the least amount of energy. So these are typically found in people's homes. They can take anywhere from 40 to 50 hours to go from an empty battery to a complete charge. And the reason these are mostly in people's homes are just because it's pretty impractical to sit your car somewhere for 40 hours. It's not your house. Level 2 charging stations are also found in people's homes, but they can be found in some public places. So you might find them at like your workplace where you're expected to sit for 8 hours, or maybe even at like an amusement park where you're going to be for a while. They take about 4 to 10 hours to charge. But in a lot of situations, they're not really the most practical for a public charging station. And they take a little bit more energy than a level 1 charger. So really, when we're discussing EV charging stations, we really want to focus on the fast charging because these are the most practical for people driving around in their day-to-day life. On average, they take about 30 minutes to charge from 0 to 80% battery, but they do take a lot of energy from the grid, and that's going to be important to consider as we go forward. Another thing that I want to highlight before we move on is that we're going to be using EV and ZEV fairly interchangeably today. An EV is an electric vehicle and a ZEV is a zero emission vehicle. Zero emission vehicle is an umbrella term, which includes any vehicle that's zero emission. So any vehicle really that's not gas powered. So that includes electric vehicles, but it can also include other vehicles like hydrogen. We're going to be using them interchangeably today though, because EVs have really taken over the ZEV market. And so in general, when people are thinking about ZEVs, they're mostly thinking about EVs. So when we consider the rural EV landscape, the first thing you'll notice is there is a huge infrastructure disparity between rural California and urban California. A 2021 study found that Of all of the public and privately shared EV infrastructure in California, only 7.5% of it was found in rural places. And so you can see that on this map up here on the screen. So we have these lightly colored areas, which is where there's a lower density of charging stations compared to these dark ones here, which have higher density. And this next image here, you can actually see where the charging stations are. And so you can see in these major metropolitan areas, like in San Francisco, like in LA, there's so many charging stations, you can't even see them on the map. But then you have all of these rural places where there are no chargers at all. And so when we're considering this, we really want to focus on this disparity. This disparity is caused by a lot of reasons, but one of the main ones is the technological limitations. So as I mentioned, DC fast chargers really need a lot of energy from the grid. And in a lot of places in rural California, the grid isn't adequate, or it might not even be connected at all, depending on where you're looking. And so it's an extra step to installing EV chargers in rural places if they don't have a good connection to the grid. Expanding this grid is really complex. It's pretty expensive. It can be a technological challenge. And there's other technological challenges to consider, other infrastructure. For example, there might not be adequate roads to the space that you want to build your charging station. There may not be access to broadband, which some chargers do need to be able to run their paying systems. And so there's just a lot more issues with setting it up in rural places than in urban areas because these urban areas already have the infrastructure to build charging stations on top of. Another consideration is the policy challenges. So just like building anything in California, there are more regulatory barriers here to build EV chargers than in other places. A 2019 study by Electrify America found that on average, it took 75 business days to get a permit in California to build a charging station as compared to the national average of 44 days. In that same study, they also found that on average, it was 24% more expensive to get these permits than it was in other areas in the country. Another policy challenge is the initiatives and grant funding that is available. There are a lot of initiatives and a lot of grants that are available in California, but a large majority of them, either explicitly or inexplicitly, really focus more on urban development. And the reason being is because of the idea of shovel ready. So the Golden State Priority Project is an example of this. This is an initiative that has set aside money specifically for developing EV infrastructure. However, in the language of the bill, it prioritizes shovel-ready sites. Shovel-ready sites are what they sound like. They are areas that are immediately ready to be built on. So as we're talking about these technological limitations of having to build out infrastructure to get to a place where you could build EV chargers, that's not considered shovel-ready. And so these rural places that already have the technological limitations are also not given access to a lot of the grant funding that exists. So why should the government get involved? In reality, we really already are. We set a mandate in 2020 saying that by 2035, all of the ZEVs or all of the vehicles sold in California have to be ZEVs. That's only a decade away. And we have steps along the way that we're expected to meet. So by 2026, which is a year and a half from now, 35% of all new cars sold in California are expected to be ZEVs. And by 2030, 68%. And so if we want to meet these targets that we have set out as a state, then we really do need to build EV infrastructure to make this actual accessible goal. Another consideration is the equity concerns. So in rural California, there's already a lot of socioeconomic disparities between urban areas. I've mentioned a lot of the technological limitations, but these really impact people's day-to-day life, right? You know, you probably use internet all of the time, whereas people in rural places may not have access to broadband. They, on average, have less access to water infrastructure, to public health infrastructure, to education, and on average are more likely to be low income than their urban counterparts. And so we want to make sure that when we are putting in a mandate, like saying that anybody who wants to purchase a new car has to purchase a ZEV, that we actually have the infrastructure to support that so we don't continue to build this divide between urban and rural places. Another consideration also for the socioeconomic impact is that a lot of rural areas really depend on tourism as a main driver of their economic development. And with that in mind, we want to make sure that people are able to travel freely across the state. So people in urban places that are likely to travel to urban areas, people in urban areas that are likely to travel to rural places, If they're buying EVs, which our maps show that that's really where the concentration of EVs are, then we need them to be able to get to these rural places and spend their money. Otherwise, again, we're going to just continue to deepen the divide between urban and rural access. And in general, it would be nice as a Californian to be able to travel across your whole state. If we are going to impose mandates on people that require them to purchase these cars, we need them to buy in. And part of that buying in is that we want them to feel comfortable and know that they can travel around freely and not worry about their car dying before having access to another charging station. And lastly, California has been a leader in climate change policy for a very long time. This mandate is just another example of that. So if we want to continue being leaders and try to reduce our reliance on gas-powered vehicles, to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and to reduce our air pollution, then we really do need to build this infrastructure, because without this infrastructure, there's not going to be enough demand for EVs for people to want to purchase them. So all of that is really what builds out what we call our problem tree. Our problem tree here has our problem statement in the center, which again is that rural California counties have too few resources and too many barriers to build adequate publicly available EV infrastructure. And a lot of the things I've already discussed are the causes of these issues, right? So we have the power grids that are inadequate, the regulatory barriers, the funding priorities of the state and the federal government. Another consideration is the slow pace of building infrastructure versus the rapid pace of technology change. And so that's something to consider as well. As we're trying to build this infrastructure out, we need to be able to make sure our policies can adapt as new technology changes with EVs. And then just geography in general, not much we can do about that, but it is technically more complicated to build infrastructure in mountains than it is in the Sacramento Valley. And all of these causes here lead to the effects up at top. So we have the main effect, which is a limited amount of EV infrastructure in rural California, but all of that moves into the reduced demand for EVs, the failure to meet our mandate, the inability to travel across the state, and increased range anxiety, which is that fear that you're going to run out of power before you get to a charging station. And so now that you guys have an understanding of what our problem is, we want to go over the criteria alternative matrix, or our CAM. So the criteria alternative matrix is really the rubric we're going to be using to weigh and judge the policy solutions that are going to be presented by Tim and Christine and Colin. We came up with this criteria in part with Rob and with Bob, our client, based on the things that we felt was most important to the EV landscape. So our criteria is efficiency, equity, and future-proofing. Efficiency is, of course, the most bang for your buck. But for our consideration, because we are representing the RCRC, which represents the rural counties, we are considering our policies more efficient if they draw money from existing sources, such as sources from the federal government or sources that the state has already set aside. So if it doesn't take more money out of the county's pocket directly, we're considering that more efficient, even if dollar per dollar, it's not the most efficient. Another consideration is for equity. Of course, we are considering low income and disadvantaged communities, but we are also considering the elimination of charging deserts. Charging deserts are any radial area of 50 miles or more that does not have a charging station. And the reason we're putting this in our equity concerns is because if we only build charging stations in low-income places or in disadvantaged communities, but we don't build charging stations connecting them to other parts of the state, we'll effectively put people on an island. We want to make sure that everyone can access the entire state at any time and not force people into limited areas because that's the only place where they can charge their car. And then for future proofing, this is that idea of the infrastructure taking a very long time to build and technology changing very quickly. For example, even just the port that your car plugs into from the charging station, if something like that were to change, we would have to be able to go through all of our EV infrastructure and update it. And so we want to make sure that any policy we do have is able to adapt and change with technology and doesn't invest all of our time and money into something that is going to be irrelevant in a few years. That being said, we're not giving these all an even weight. So we do recognize that some of these are more important than others. We've decided that equity is the most important, given that this is really an equity-driven initiative in the first place. To focus on rural California is to say that we're focusing on equity. If we were looking at building charging stations just where the most people would use them, we would continue developing them in urban areas. We also recognize that efficiency is really important given that it is expensive to build all of this infrastructure. So even though we're not weighing it as high as equity at 50%, we're giving efficiency 30 because we considered our next most important goal. And then we're weighting future proofing at 20% because we do consider it important, but not as important as the other two. Are there any questions before I hand it off to Colin?
I have a brief one. On future proofing, you're still going all in for EVs. You're not thinking about ZEVs, something that could be built that would actually be able to change over to hydrogen instead of electrical?
Only for the scope of the thought experiment academically, but in a like real policy sense, of course, we would want to consider all of ZEVs as an option. But for the scope of our assignment, we are limiting it to EVs.
You mentioned about state and federal funding to minimize the counties paying. In your guys' research, were there specific funding grants or programs that you guys were researching in, or was it like a broad scope?
There are a lot. Like it would be hard to stand here and list them all. So even just the recent infrastructure bill that was passed by the Biden administration has money set aside for building infrastructure. There are multiple state initiatives. So there are a lot of them, kind of considering them broadly for the introduction, but I believe the individual presentations may go into them more in depth. With that, I'll bring Colin up.
Thanks, Megan. That was a great introduction. And Natalie, your question was a great segue to my alternative. So my name is Colin Green. I am working on a funding alternative I call Revin Up, which stands for Rural EV Infrastructure Upgrades. I want to give a big shout out to my stakeholder, Brad Kenson. He's a managing partner at Fast Track Power. I met Brad at a CEC, California Energy Commission funding workshop, where he provided some great expert insights on some solicitation that was happening. So as Megan mentioned, here's our problem tree. The causes that my solution will be addressing are the funding priorities for the state and the inadequate power grid that we have. So here's our lovely map of California to ground us. And here are the NEVI corridors. So NEVI stands for the National EV Infrastructure, and every state will have a map like this where we're trying to build out transportation corridors with EV charging throughout that traverse the whole region. While looking at this, we can see the clean transportation funding programs activities have put charging sites throughout the state. This mirrors Megan's map pretty well of where charging infrastructure has been developed. We can see down in urban areas that's pretty densely populated, and in rural areas, it's kind of lacking. So the Clean Transportation Program, it has been excellent for getting EV infrastructure into the ground. It was passed in 2007 and has given out over $1 billion in funding for EV infrastructure. My solution will pull on Clean Transportation Program funds for the money. Next is this EDGE map. So EDGE is a acronym that stands for EVSE, which is another acronym, acronyms and acronyms. EVSE is EV supply equipment, and the EDGE tool compares it compares the vehicle miles traveled or a transportation analysis with grid capacity. And so we get a better understanding of where we lack grid capacity and charging capacity compared to vehicle miles traveled. And so you can see in some rural communities, see if I can get this pointer to work. Up here, we got some dark areas that do not have good grid capacity compared to the amount of traffic that goes through them. And so that is really helpful for identifying areas that need more infrastructure development. So here's the Clean Transportation Fund. I'm going to dig into this a little bit more. First, let's talk about why urban communities have been prioritized. This wasn't intentional in the fact that we're excluding rural communities, more that how we weight our funding programs has favored these urban communities. Like Megan described, shovel-ready sites, this California Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Project, Cal EVIP, prioritizes shovel-ready sites in its like language. It says we need these sites to be shovel-ready. Another thing that it does is that it requires a 50% stakeholder investment. And that is a lot of money for these big infrastructure investments for a rural community. For an urban community, they can absolutely make that investment. But for a rural community that doesn't have people that are engaged and aren't bought in on EVs, they're like, I'm not going to spend 50 grand, 100 grand, $200,000 on this kind of investment. The next clean transportation funding bucket is communities in charge. Again, it's prioritizes urban communities. This one in particular looks to fund mixed use development and multifamily homes, and gets funding to those homes, and it only gives level 2 charging. So again, not great for rural communities because it's giving funding for the apartment complexes and for like townhomes and things like that. So the shared private is something that works towards. Next one is that EDGE infrastructure assessment tool. It's not really a funding project, but it does help our EV landscape here. And so it's good for both the urban and the rural communities. Finally, these are the two proposals that I'm going to dig into the most throughout this presentation. We've got Rural Electric Vehicle Charging 2.0. I'm going to refer to this as REV 2.0 throughout the rest of the presentation. And REV 2.0 has not been fully passed yet, or it's not been fully defined yet. It's still in the workshop phase. That's where I met Brad, was at the workshop for this funding. And it's great to get some money going towards rural communities, but it is not complete, so to speak. And so my funding proposal will come in and help fill some gaps that REV 2.0 misses. So REV 2.0 is the nuts and bolts of it is that it provides $20 million of funding towards rural communities. It can be up to $8 million per project, or less than that. It can be much lower if need be. It requires a 20% cost share. So this is way better than that Cal EVIP program in terms of the cost share. And in terms of the what's eligible, it allows for $100,000 per DC fast charger on a given project. I bring this up because I'm going to talk about the costs of DC fast versus transformers and other electrical equipment later on. So what REV 2.0, how it funds programs or how it's going to pass out the money is based on this scoring criteria. And project location is great. That's all only rural centers and rural communities there. But project budget and project implementation and readiness could make this project proposal target shovel ready yet again, because we're going to be weighting those communities way higher that have done this infrastructure upgrade. They're prepared and ready to get chargers in the ground. So the Rev and Up proposal differs from the Rev 2.0 proposal because it tries to bridge the gap between assessments and shovel ready. It provides money for soft costs such as planning and construction, as well as the hard costs of the infrastructure upgrades like transformers, switchgear, panels, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of those costs and utility upgrades that this money would go towards. It also, just like Rev 2.0, gives money towards rural centers and rural areas, but it does provide fewer projects with funding because it's more comprehensive. So this is a place where I'll ding it for its equity because it's not putting charging throughout as much of the state as Rev 2.0 potentially could. The other thing where it does improve is a match requirement, and that's aligned with community size or their ability to pay, as to not exclude a rural community that doesn't have the ability to get engaged like a larger rural community could. We don't want to dock a community that is a charging desert because they can't invest all this money into the EV infrastructure, and it could really like unlock or bridge the gap between two rural communities. Finally, these sites should be scalable. We should overdevelop them now so that we're prepared for growing EV infrastructure in the future. These sites will be, if the current demand is for 1 or 2 chargers, we should be prepared to put 5 or 6 there in the future, so that way they can expand as down the line. So now I'm going to talk about the costs of these proposals. So the DC fast chargers I've highlighted here. This is that. So Revit 2.0 provides up to $100,000 for a DC fast charger. Turns out they can cost a little bit more at times, but it's a good baseline to start from. This highlights only one of the many utility upgrades that could be required, and transformers are almost as expensive as the DC fast charger itself. And so getting that rural infrastructure upgrade is really important and really expensive. Additionally, we've got our soft costs highlighted in the pie graphs on the left side of the screen. And construction costs make up a lot of that. And so that's why we've been willing to pay for that with this proposal. Here's a model for this idea. So the CEC, the California Energy Commission, is the group that would administer this grant, and they already provide funding in a really straightforward and streamlined way for medium and heavy duty vehicles. This is the website for this Energize funding source, which is what provides for the medium and heavy duty. And there's a lot of different funding avenues for those medium and heavy duty vehicles. And it's already a complex landscape to figure out how to engage with all this money that's out there. And so I want to streamline it and create buckets for the rural communities to get the funding that they need. And so we have a model within the CEC already. So let's use that same model and make it look something like this, where we have rural 2.0. It's a fast track program because the sites are shovel ready. And then we've got some assessment funding to get people off the ground if they haven't done that already. And then finally, my proposal is that bridge between the assessments and the Rev 2.0. Here's my logic model. It follows the standard form for a funding logic model with the CEC and their inputs and their activities. It'll create this grant program and the bucket system to organize the extra grant that we're throwing in here, and it'll create the infrastructure outcomes that we would expect. Finally, how I've rated my criteria. First is efficiency. Because of that 30% or that percentage to the counties having to pay, I've rated this as a 4 in efficiency because I added that sliding scale for the rural communities to engage with it. So it's a relatively efficient for proposal for the rural counties. In terms of equity, I gave it a 3 because it has less sites, and although those sites are more developed. So fewer sites, but it's more expensive in that space. And then future proofing, because the sites will be modular and we can build them up in a to meet the need in the future, then that makes it a more future-proof policy. And we're not actually putting chargers in the ground with this. You'd look towards other federal money or other state money to get the chargers off the ground, and that would allow them to pivot to whatever the current standard is once the chargers go in. So with that, does anybody have any questions? I see Natalie reaching for the mic.
So you mentioned about the Rev 2.0 and how that is like an application process. And then Rev in would also be like an application process, but it has like that scalability. In the Rev in proposal, because I know from experience, like writing grants and, the application process is, quite laborious. If a county got accepted for the Rev in grant, would they be able to fast track for the Rev 2.0 grants? Would they have like an advantage because they've already gone through this process with the state, and now that they've done the Rev in, they kind of have more leverage in the Rev 2.0?
That's a great question. And because Rev 2.0 isn't defined yet, it hasn't been it starts in 2025. I didn't consider that, but I think that would be a great way to streamline the process, and like maybe the forms can be duplicative, and so you could just like already filled out this form for this one, let's apply it to the next one. Or yeah, that's a fast tracking it would be a really good idea. But your point there that one should flow into the other is really, really important. Seeing no other questions, I'll pass it over to Tim.
Thank you, Colin and Megan. My name is Timothy Nash, and I will be presenting to you alternative number 2, community power, streamlining the future. So alternative number 2 revolves around the creation of administrative teams at the county level to recognize common needs in these rural communities and develop plans to implement electric vehicle infrastructure and prepare them for the future in order for them to gain these benefits from EV infrastructure. These benefits include reaching climate goals at the local, state, and federal level, promoting the ease of interstate travel, and increasing tourism. Now, some of the problems that are faced by this alternative include the consistency in the implementation, dealing with limited resources, and navigating public reception. This is our group's problem tree. My alternative is focused on these two items that are highlighted here at the bottom: the slow pace of building infrastructure versus rapidly changing technology, and regulatory barriers. I would like to take a moment to thank my stakeholder, Janet Orth. She is the Deputy Director and Chief Financial Officer for the Mendocino Council of Governments. She has over 25 years of experience working on environmental and transportation initiatives with the Mendocino Council of Governments, and was a valuable resource and came highly recommended by our client, Bob. So I wanted to give a brief history of electric vehicle efforts throughout California and Mendocino County specifically. In 1990, the California Air Resource Board instituted a mandate that 2% of all vehicles sold in California would be zero emission by 1998. So because of that, Mendocino County began an exploratory committee on electric vehicles. And by 1998, they became the first regional transportation planning agency to research and test electric vehicles and their practicality. Now, there were some roadblocks involved in this. There are a lot of negative media representation and issues with oil companies and car manufacturers that eventually caused the CARB mandate to lessen and eventually reverse, and stalled EV efforts towards the end of the 90s. But what was learned is that citizens in Mendocino County specifically, they enjoyed electric vehicles. They found them to be quite practical, and a lot of the studies involved showed their eagerness and willingness to continue in that method. So by the late 2000s, when hybrids began bringing a renewed interest in electric vehicles, it was the right time for them to pursue this on a larger level. So the North State Super Region consists of 16 of California's northernmost counties. In 2010, these counties came together, and the Regional Transportation Planning Agency directors from each county signed a memorandum of agreement in an effort to combat what was perceived to be less of a focus on rural county transportation initiatives. So as you can see, the North State Super Region is a pretty large portion of the state, over 40,000 miles, about a quarter of all our land area, and it has 37% of all state and federal roads. Within the North State Super Region, there are working groups, and specifically the Zero Emission Vehicle Working Group, which focuses on zero emission vehicle infrastructure. So I've noted several counties and that have developed readiness plans to prepare each county and their transportation for the future. Some of these counties include Mendocino, Del Norte, Butte, and Humboldt and Trinity and Siskiyou combined into the Redwood Coast Energy Authority. These readiness plans look at different aspects of the county and determine what their current state is as to how ready they are for implementing EV infrastructure at a clerical level, at all across the board, and public reception as well. So I wanted to highlight Mendocino County here as a leader in the North State Super Region with the number of chargers that they have. So nearly 200 public chargers and 35 shared private chargers. And then a comparison of the 16 counties. So these top 5 counties on the left end are all counties that have pretty comprehensive readiness plans, creating a good roadmap for implementing electric vehicle infrastructure. Mendocino, Shasta, Humboldt, Butte, all these counties, I reviewed some readiness plans, and they not only that, but the number of chargers doubled from Q2 of 2020 to Q4 of 2023. So you can see the orange is Q2 of 2020, and the blue is Q4 of 2023. They doubled across the entire region of 16 counties, but specifically the counties at the left end, Mendocino and Shasta, doubled their own chargers. So why should government get involved? In order to navigate some externalities, including moderating massive technological growth, and I think a big part of this is to create a historical record, really, and having reports and discoveries on what was done in order to move forward in the future, and equity considerations, including building up communities and recognizing local needs and having them tailored to their specific needs. Through this, I believe it's important for them to maximize their public resources and create consistency across these needs. So why else should government get involved? It already is. As Megan mentioned, there is the mandate for all electric vehicles in California to be, for all vehicles sold in California by 2035 to be electric. And assembly bills, including AB 1236 and AB 970 from 2015 and 2021, respectively. I swear I showered. Assembly Bills 1236 and 970 revolve around the permitting process. As Megan mentioned, up until 2019, the permitting process in California was quite cumbersome and took a long time for these local jurisdictions to review and implement permits in California. So these assembly bills address these regulatory barriers, such as the lengthy approval process, complex zoning requirements, and inconsistencies across the region. It also creates a few new hurdles as well. While it is streamlined, the staffing needed to process permits at an adequate rate and meet the timelines set by these assembly bills. So for jurisdictions with more than 200,000 residents, it went into effect in January of 2022. And for those with less than 200,000 residents, in January of 2023. And on the right here, I have the scoring criteria for the permitting process. It includes certain things such as whether or not they accept electronic signatures and whether their administrative teams have the capacity to process these in a timely manner. This is a roadmap of the permitting process. And despite being streamlined, it is still fairly bureaucratic. People still need to navigate this. There are health and safety things involved. The permit submittal, it might have to happen more than once. And the approval to build can take up to 40 days. So I want to go over some of the design elements and choices of this alternative. So a good design element here is regional education and just keeping everybody involved in the community, up to date and aware of electric vehicle infrastructure and their plans for it. So this includes focused funding plans for citizens to know where the money for their county is being spent on these plans and design choices. Some of my design choices include the design choices, the administrative teams working on the readiness plans and rolling them out to the citizens. So the unique attributes of my alternative, I think there's a collaboration is the big thing, and synergy, specifically with the North State super region. We have 16 counties sharing geographic makeup for the most part. A lot of them are very low on population, and having the unique ability to recognize common needs with neighboring counties and use the counties that are exceeding, such as Mendocino and Shasta, and helping out some of the other ones that might not be moving along quite as quick in order to meet the 2035 mandate and the benchmarks along the way as well. Here I have my logic model. So for the inputs, I have the executive order, which is, of course, the impetus for this project, and any existing funding, things that are earmarked by the state and federal grants that come down, and utilizing county staff and additional stakeholders. These other stakeholders include partnering with firms to develop the readiness plans and speaking with legislatures as well. So the activities that these inputs are completing is training the staff to review and research their findings for the readiness plans, completing community outreach and public information campaigns, and documenting all their services as well. Now, the documentation is very important, specifically for the future-proofing part of this project. So they will report out their findings, and this will result in increasing EV infrastructure, meeting the benchmarks of the executive order and all of our climate goals. So the biggest mediating factors I've noticed, and when I spoke with my stakeholder, Janet, includes staffing. There are great concerns, and this is mentioned across several different readiness plans that I reviewed. There are great concerns about having the appropriate amount of staff in order to complete this. This includes the permit processing, completing communication, active public information campaigns. Those all require county staff or partnering with private firms in order to complete, and is an issue. And outside the studio, I think the biggest issues encountered are the rapidly changing technology. The tech industry is incredibly volatile and changes quite quickly. And also any other competing industries involved. So my quantitative criteria alternative matrix, I have listed efficiency at a 4. I think utilizing county staff and already existing funding is the most efficient use of that funding. With equity, I have it at a 3 just because while some counties have readiness plans that are good to go, other counties are falling behind a little bit and don't have the current staff available to even get to that point. So those that are favored, so grant funding favors those with readiness plans and those that have taken the time in the recent past to get to that point already. And for future proof, I put this at a 5. I strongly believe that having this well documented and thoroughly researched allows them to not only move forward with electric vehicle infrastructure, but to also pivot in case something else becomes more apparent in the future. If hydrogen powered turns out to be more effective and easy to maintain, they can switch to that if they have the documented readiness plans. Any questions?
You mentioned that your stakeholder was Janet, and I wanted to ask, did you talk to her about the North State, the ZEV working group that she's a part of, and how much involvement and work do they do in this kind of process in your alternative?
Yeah, I did talk to her about, I did talk with her about that a little bit, and I watched one of the more recent presentations that she gave. Use that as a source as well. And yeah, so they, I think most recently, I don't remember the date, but they were kind of giving a state, or like an overview of where they were at and showing where Mendocino is, and encouraging the other counties to kind of get to that point as well, and some of the hurdles, but yes.
I have also a follow-up question. We see Mendocino County like in the lead. Has there been conversations about the counties that are, progressing with their numbers? What's their involvement with helping some of their neighboring counties who might be struggling to get implementation or even to get working relationships with like state agencies and stuff?
With state agencies, I'm not sure, but the ZEV working group does go over that quite a bit. I don't know. Mendocino is working with ChargePoint, is the one implementing their charging services, and kind of just sharing their process of going through that. Yes, they've done that quite a bit. Yes.
Chargers in your county draw tourists away from another county. Is that any type of a concern why you don't want to share?
I'm not sure. I know that they have to get there through certain ways. I guess if they're utilizing different routes to get through those counties and not wanting to share. But I think the overall sentiment of at least the North State Super Region in my research was very collaborative and very interested in building up the community in general. I'm sure there is some competition involved, but if we encourage that in general, I think it would lead to an overall better product in getting them all up to scale. Thank you. I'm going to pass it off to Christine.
All right. Okay, so for my project, I decided to focus on microgrids and distributed energy resources as a way to build out rural EV charging in rural communities to address the need for resilience in rural communities. And I will talk more about what microgrids and distributed energy resources are in a couple minutes. But basically, this approach is really looking at the infrastructure behind the infrastructure, right? Because when we're talking about building out EV charging in rural communities, that has to plug into an electric grid, right? So we also have to address what is the capacity of the grid to handle all of this EV infrastructure that we're building out in rural communities. So I kind of went overboard and talked to a lot of people. So these are all the people I talked to. And Ben Schwartz was able to join us. He's online now and will be joining the panel. And he's from Clean Coalition, which is a nonprofit organization that focuses on how can we accelerate this transition to renewable energy through policy and providing technical assistance. And then you can see some of the other organizations that I engaged, including RCRC. Okay. And then in terms of the problem tree, my solution focuses on these parts of the problem tree. So regulatory barriers, funding priorities of state and federal government, the inadequacy of the power grid and lack of adequate electrical infrastructure in rural communities. And then also just the consequences of our existing grid system when it's the kind of market structure of our current electric grid. And we'll talk about fair market pricing in a bit. Okay. So what are microgrids and distributed energy resources? So distributed energy resources are small scale decentralized electricity supply or demand resources. When I say demand resources, that could also be ways to regulate how much energy is being used. So it could be like energy efficiency, like smart technology as well. And it's typically located close to where the energy is used. So when you think of solar panels on your house, that's close to where the energy is being used versus like a big power plant that's, miles away, 50, 100 miles away. These are typically interconnected to the central grid. And I mentioned solar panels. Other energy sources could be wind farms, battery storage. Actually, electric vehicles can be a power source, fuel cells, and also just commercial backup generators. Some features of distributed energy resources is usually there's some level of automation involved. Technology that allows them to synchronize and connect to the grid. Also metering to measure the energy inflow and outflow. And then also sometimes there could be software to aggregate energy from multiple sources. And then a microgrid just means interconnected DERs that can both actually separate from the grid and work without being connected to the grid, and what we sometimes call islanding, or can actually be interconnected to the grid. So, Okay, so wanted to, before I get into some of the details, I wanted to kind of establish the need for looking at supporting grid capacity. So as we continue to make this transition to our climate change goals, Megan mentioned earlier, our 2035 ZEV goals that all new sales of ZEVs by 2035 be electric vehicles. So we're going to have a lot more vehicles plugging into the grid. In addition to EV charging, we're moving towards greater electrification of buildings, moving away from gas. Also, data centers are a huge load on the grid, and actually the cannabis industry adds a lot to the grid. Also, with our climate change goals, as we continue to phase out additional sources of energy, fossil fuel power plants, nuclear, like Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, for example, that's scheduled to close down by 2030. Once through cooling is a technology that puts uses some gas power and fossil fuels to move large amounts of water through the power plant, and that is being phased out in 2029. So as these sources of energy generation get phased out, and we start to add more energy on the grid, that's also a consideration. And then in rural communities, there's various vulnerabilities with the grid and a certain level of unreliability. So by looking at the grid, not only are we paying attention to our EV goals, but we're also addressing a fundamental need in rural communities in terms of having a reliable grid. So a lot of times there's insufficient grid infrastructure out in rural communities where it's more remote. There may be difficult terrain in certain parts of rural communities that would make it hard to build out transmission lines, or particularly if you need to underground transmission lines, that's difficult to do in certain terrain. And then, of course, we know about wildfire threats in rural communities and what's becoming more common in terms of power shutoffs. And some rural communities can be without power for quite a long time. One of the case studies that I'll talk about in a minute, the Redwood Coast airport microgrid, that was partly in response to repeated power shutoffs in the community. And, they could be without power for a couple days if the utility decided there was a wildfire threat and they had to shut down the power. And then, of course, resources are more geographically distant in rural communities and emergencies, right? You might have to travel farther to evacuate or to reach a hospital. And then this is not really specific to rural communities, but in general, rising electric rates impacts everyone, right? Whether in rural or rural communities, and a lot of the raises in our prices tie back to the costs of building out the transmission grid. And so, when we look at distributed energy resources and microgrids, we are looking at a way to decrease the level of investment in building out that transmission grid, because we're tapping into additional resources as well. Okay, so for this policy solution, the design elements are streamlining various regulations that impact the grid. And so that involves a lot of regulations from the California Public Utilities Commission, as well as the California Independent Service Operator, which regulates a lot of the energy that comes on and off the transmission grid and makes sure that we have enough energy on the grid at any point in time. And fair market pricing, which I'll talk about in a bit in terms of like who's compensated for what and what's built into that pricing. And then federal and state funding priorities, how do we prioritize certain communities or certain ways of providing energy in our funding sources for EVs or whatnot. And then also public-private partnerships. And then the design choices, and I'll go more into these in the next slides, so I'll talk about I'll talk later about what resource adequacy payments are. But let's see. So tariffs, you see tariffs there, microgrid tariffs, emergency services tariffs. So in the utilities world, tariffs are just kind of systems for regulating how much you have to pay and how much you can get compensated for the way that you participate in the grid. And so different types of entities fall under different tariff systems. There, so like a large scale, power plant or something would fall under a particular service tariff. And then a kind of a smaller scale, like your, solar, panels on your roof generating energy, that falls under a different system. So that's just what that's referring to when we say tariffs. But that list basically is, just a mix of different ways of compensating different entities in that system, looking at how, looking at our processes to interconnect to the grid and to energize things that we are connecting into the grid and how long it takes. And then how do we prioritize funding for all of this work? Okay. So this is a case study of a microgrid that was built out recently in the Humboldt County area at an airport, actually. And this system helps to offset daily electricity usage at the airport. It includes solar panels, battery storage. It also includes electric vehicle charging stations. And they actually lease the land from Humboldt County, but instead of paying lease payments, they actually provide renewable energy instead. And it was supported by a couple grants. So CEC, California Energy Commission grant called the Electric Program Investment Charge, as well as a federal grant from the USDA. This also serves the energy needs of the Coast Guard Station for search and rescue on 250 miles of the coastline. And since it has been completed, it has actually been able to provide consistent power through power outages from an earthquake and several storms since then. When I was talking to a staff person from RCEA, he mentioned that in their process of figuring out how to finance this, they ended up choosing a lower power capacity to go with to avoid having to upgrade the distribution lines to save some costs. And that's something that, is always kind of a balance with these projects, because when you go above a certain capacity and then that creates additional costs for having to build out the distribution lines. Let's see. And I wanted to share some of these slides from the Redwood Coast Energy Authority, just because I know it kind of ties into our class. I know we talked a lot about cost benefit analysis. And so this is sort of their cost benefit analysis. They looked at, what is it going to cost us over 25 years to like build the system, and then the cost of the system over 25 years. And then the revenues and benefits that we'll get from it. So before adding, other benefits beyond just the straight revenues from the system, this is what their cost benefit analysis looks like at the beginning. So you can see they identified that there is a $5 million gap in terms of the cost that they were putting out and the revenues that they were getting in. But when they added to that cost benefit analysis and quantified the value of other benefits from that system, so you can see here in the little honeycomb little shapes there, there's different things that they identify, different benefits, and the ones that are in green are the only ones that they actually built into the cost benefit analysis and quantified. So there's a lot there that they're actually still not quantifying in this as a benefit. And they, assigned resiliency values or, quantify the cost of being able to support the Coast Guard, to continue emergency rescues during power outages and sustaining commercial business activity during an outage. Other things that they didn't work into this analysis were things like the ability to provide timely medical care, supporting emergency command and control centers, delivering crucial medical supplies through the airport, job creation, progress towards their renewable energy goals. The benefits would have been a lot higher if they had also quantified those things. And you can see these are some of a little bit more of that analysis. And so when they built that in, you can see how their cost benefit analysis changed, and now that gap is smaller. And so I just thought that was a interesting analysis to share that ties into our class. Let's see. Okay, so now I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on the different design choices that were listed a little bit earlier. And we talked a little bit about how Redwood Coast built out their microgrid. And so, when we think about solutions, we also have to think about like, how do we pay for the system and how do we continue to pay for it? Like, and, are the ways that different entities in that system who are generating energy, are they being compensated fairly? So in terms of paying for the cost of the system, which can range pretty greatly depending on how the scale of your microgrid or your DER system, it can be anywhere from thousands to millions. There was another system in Southern California that was about $5 million to build, and that supported basically a couple pretty large multi-story commercial buildings. So in terms of the upfront costs, those can be pretty high, especially now at this time when it's still a fairly new technology and there's still a lot developing. And so finding ways to help subsidize that upfront cost is important. And that's something that Redwood Coast Energy Authority has been working on with PG&E, and PG&E was kind of looking at their project as a pilot and had discussed, PG&E providing some subsidies for that upfront cost. There's tax credits as well. So in a lot of cases, or pretty much in most cases, microgrids are built out by private developers because it's a very specific, specialized technology. The system in Southern California that I mentioned was built by private developers who were able to get some money back through a tax credit called the investment tax credit. It's a federal tax credit for solar energy. And so this was kind of a benefit to them. And the community was actually, I don't know if it's specific to this case study, but there are Clean Coalition has looked at other microgrid projects where the community has the opportunity to actually, even though it's first built and owned by that private developer, they have the opportunity to own it after a certain amount of time. So like after 25 years, the developer will offer the municipality the ability to buy that system for $1, because after 25 years, it's pretty much paid for itself, and then it then belongs to the municipality. And then we talked about different forms of grant funding earlier. So in addition to the CEC and USDA, there's another one from the Department of Energy that has a grant program for grid resilience infrastructure. Let's see. So in terms of compensation for energy produced, so resource adequacy is a term that describes so a requirement that utilities are required to meet to have a certain amount of capacity at any time on the grid. Right now, it has to be generally about 117%. And the thing with resource adequacy is that it it usually compensates larger scale generation more than it does decentralized energy generation. So this is something that, when we look at investing in more decentralized forms of renewable energy, is something that needs to be reformed so that there's more adequate compensation, and that these decentralized forms of energy generation could also participate in that market and make it more viable to build these out. So right now it's, if you're a larger like power plant, then you can go through that wholesale market to participate in this. But generally, if you're like a more smaller decentralized source of energy, then it's harder to get access to this. I named microgrid tariffs here just to, just name something that would need to be reformed. So this SB 1339 just established the requirement in 2018 for the CPUC to establish a tariff system, and so that's still under development, and they've been engaging stakeholders to build that out. But this is kind of a venue where a lot of these reforms that we're talking about can be built into. So emergency services tariff is an interesting proposal from the Microgrid Resources Coalition that they proposed during the pandemic. They proposed that there be an emergency services tariff where microgrids and DERs that were providing emergency services off of the grid, like in a time of emergency, they were providing power to essential critical infrastructure, that they would be able to be compensated for this. Another part of that is the idea of resiliency incentive payment for microgrids that serve critical facilities like hospitals, emergency operation centers, nursing facilities, fire stations, that they get compensated pretty much the equivalent of the cost savings of not having to use a backup diesel generator. So that's, something to consider. Another concept is dynamic versus departing load. And so a lot of times utilities will have costs to when you decide not to participate in that main grid and you have your own energy generation. Sometimes there's fees associated with that. And if you're trying to build out, just a decentralized energy generation system, that can add to the cost of your project. There is an example of a microgrid that actually the University of California was building, and that supported several campuses and hospitals. And they couldn't complete the project before an exemption for universities from departing load charges expired. And this actually pretty much like doubled their cost for their project. So, so it's something that can be reformed. And then generally, I think just the basic concept too of, counting these decentralized resources as energy resources that either add to or reduce the need for capacity of that central grid, right? And so when it's not counted, then it's not being accounted for all this planning out of the grid. There can be over planning, which leads to additional costs and additional prices or higher prices for ratepayers, right? And so we need to make sure that we're really counting that appropriately and pricing that appropriately so that we're not overbuilding that central transmission grid as well, and causing price hikes for everyone. Let's see. I know I'm getting towards. So this is just one more example of how we can have more appropriate pricing structure. So this is an analysis from the Clean Coalition, and they have just pointed out that, the way that transmission access charges, which are built into our costs as ratepayers, the way they're structured, let me show you this. This is from one of their slides. The way it's structured, it makes the cost cheaper for remote generation, even though it's actually ignoring the transmission costs required by, to move energy that far, right? And it's ignoring the cost saved by local generation. And so when you actually build in, actually acknowledge the cost of that remote generation, and you build in the cost savings from local generation, it's a much different price structure. So I just thought that was interesting to look at too. And also in our class, because we apply microeconomic analysis in our class and have talked about externalities, I just think that it's interesting to look at when you decide what you externalize or not into a price, right? This is how much it changes. So all right. Let's see. So this next slide just goes into different opportunities to kind of streamline the ways that distributed energy resources and microgrids interconnect to the grid, and the process for them to start delivering power once they're established. And this, it's not just relevant for EVs. There's been a lot of delays of infrastructure, like housing developments, hospitals, other critical facilities that are just waiting to to get that connection to the grid and to be electrified. And it's caused issues, like in Humboldt and Fresno County, there was housing that couldn't be built because they were just waiting for electrification by the utility company. And at one point, Fresno threatened to buy out PG&E. So it has a lot of impacts. It's not just for EVs. And so Rule 21 is I'm just calling it out here because it's just like how we mentioned microgrid tariffs before. It's just another place where all of these reforms we're talking about, this is a kind of a venue for that, because it's pretty much the rule that that kind of regulates those kind of smaller scale, more decentralized energy sources that want to connect to the grid. Typically, most of them will go through Rule 21. And then something very recently that the CPUC approved is called the limited generation profile option. It actually was just approved like about a month ago. And this actually kind of addresses that problem of overbuilding and creating these inflated costs of the transmission grid and not counting the decentralized resources, right? So this actually provides a way to better incorporate those decentralized energy resources into that grid and use that to inform how much transmission is built out. And so it basically just allows, through like different control systems and technologies and through these maps, look at the next slide, they're called integration capacity analysis maps. So it just kind of, these are maps that are publicly available that are maintained by utilities, and they map kind of the capacity, what's called the hosting capacity of the electric grid at different points in the grid. So where it's lower or higher. And so by using these maps and different technologies to kind of regulate how the energy goes on and off, to just make sure that it stays at that max capacity of the grid, so that you can maximize the number of different decentralized renewable energy resources that you're bringing onto the grid without exceeding the capacity of that grid. So it prevents having to build out more transmission infrastructure that would raise costs. So I think it's a good step forward in recognizing what decentralized energy resources bring to the grid and kind of finding a way to accommodate them. Let's see, Rule 29 is just another venue for attempting to streamline how EV charging connects to the grid. And it's just a process that you can go through that will reduce costs for EV charging when the utility will pay for some of the upfront costs for the customer who is trying to build out the EV charging infrastructure if you go through their process for Rule 29, as opposed to just kind of your normal process for connecting to the grid. And then, so in general, I think with all of these processes that we have, if we think about ways and advocate for ways to fast track, interconnection through these different venues for different communities, you know, or different systems. You know, like if we can fast track EV charging, bidirectional charging, and microgrid and distributed energy connections for underserved communities, including rural communities, then that would be a way to build on some of these efforts. Oops. Okay. And almost towards the end. So the last, let's see. So the last set of design choices address different ways to target funding priorities. So I talked about the ICA maps already. And let's see. You know, if we in pretty much the, you know, in like all of the funding sources that we have out there, whether it's federal, state funding, if we can build in funding preferences for, you know, EV charging that's connected to distributed energy resources and microgrids, especially if it's, you know, in a rural community, in a spot where it's hard to build out the transmission line there, like that should be considered an asset, right? That you're working with a microgrid system or a DER system to make that EV charging possible. So that's something that can be considered as a funding priority. And also same thing with idea, you know, with the IC maps, if you're targeting, you know, a part of the grid where it has low hosting capacity, but you're working with a DER system that makes it possible, and maybe it's kind of a high needs community as well that might otherwise not get, you know, that EV charging built in, then that can be a funding priority. And there's also just other things, you know, like for example, you know, how we define things in our funding requirements. So in the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Funding Program, the way that alternative fuel corridors are defined, they have to be no more than 50 miles apart. And so this makes it more difficult for rural communities to qualify. So something to kind of reassess. And then something that I believe is an analysis from RCRC is just how we define disadvantaged communities under the Cal EnviroScreen process, which is tied to AB 32 or cap and trade funds. And so this, you know, the way that this tool is structured, it prioritizes the amount of air pollution in communities more over the socioeconomic indicators. Those are, you know, accounted for as well, but it's the air pollution is weighted over that. And so that a lot of times rural communities are not able to qualify as a disadvantaged community. And so looking at how we define that. And I know Cal EnviroScreen has been updated. I don't know if the updated version addresses that now. I won't go into all of this, but you can take a look at it. I think I kind of addressed a lot of this already. I can maybe flag some of the mediating factors, but you know, we mentioned kind of the cost barriers at the that right now, kind of this initial stages of this building out microgrids, and then you know, something to consider in the future also is just all the raw materials, you know, for this build out, and you know, how we manage that. Let's see. So for my CAM, this is what I landed on, and let's see. So I put efficiency at a 3 because we, you know, as I mentioned, the costs are still high. We're, you know, still kind of waiting for economies of scale and new technologies or developing technologies to bring the cost down. And there's still barriers to adequate compensation in the energy market. And there's still no precedent for microgrids as standalone systems for EV charging. Typically, it will build onto microgrids that are built for like critical services, you know, like emergency operations and that sort of thing. And for equity, I rated that as a 4 because it has a lot of potential to bring down electric rates through, just through decentralized energy resources. And it fills an essential infrastructure gap in a lot of disadvantaged rural communities. But it's not higher than 4 because of the high cost and the kind of the newness of the technology still makes it a little bit more difficult to implement in smaller communities. And then for future proofing, I rated that as a 4 because I think it really does exemplify kind of the model of the electrical grid system in the future, of the kind of like the direction that we need to go in, right? Where we're no longer looking at an electric grid that is just, this centralized system that moves energy from these huge power plants hundreds of miles away in one direction, but something that's more dynamic and is able to use energy from lots of different decentralized sources and kind of regulate how it goes on and off the grid and in both directions. So that is it for me. And any questions?
So you mentioned that the microgrids are owned by the energy, like the company, like PG&E, right? Is that correct? Or are they the ones building it?
It's usually private developers that PG&E could build their own microgrid and own it if they wanted to. They may have, I don't know, but yeah.
I wanted to ask, like, the working relationship, or if you talked about this with your alternative or some of the people that you talked with, that relationship with potentially like the counties and the private developers who are building this, like how that relationship of building out, like where do they choose to build these microgrids? Like how did that process, who's the stakeholders involved in that?
Like how does the community work with the private developers to decide where to put the microgrids?
Yeah.
I think for Redwood Coast, that was, I mentioned that like right now in kind of the microgrid world, folks are mostly targeting like critical facilities, so things that need to provide essential services even when the power is out. And so that airport is also right next to a Coast Guard station. And so that was targeted as a site because of, the essential services tied to that in terms of search and rescue. And then also the airport serves critical functions too, in terms of different things that it transports. So I think right now, just in that industry, that seems to be the focus. And I'm sure that communities would provide feedback on that too. But I think as it grows and as the costs come down, there's a possibility for that to not always be kind of the first point of focus for where you site the microgrid. All right.
Well, I want to say thank you to Tim, Colin, and Christine for your policy alternatives. I'm going to go ahead and go into our conclusion now. So this would generally be the point of the presentation where we would look at the different weights of our various solutions on our CAM, and based on these weights, tell you which of them is the best recommendation. And I promise we did not plan this, but everyone came out at a 3.7. So I guess our recommendation is all of them. You can see that there is some variation, but due to the way that we are weighting equity, efficiency, and future proofing differently, they did just coincidentally all come out to 3.7. That being said, we do recognize that this is an academic thought experiment. This isn't actually the end all be all in terms of criteria. There is an infinite amount of criteria we could have weighed this against and an infinite way that we could have actually set up the weights. And these different criteria and these different weights are going to be dependent on not only who our stakeholder is that we're speaking to in the moment, but also to the time and the current policy arena. And so just to demonstrate this, we did do alternative weights to show how this might change. So in an event that we are weighting efficiency as the most important thing, Tim's solution actually comes out on top because his is the most efficient. Similarly, when we put the majority of our emphasis on future proofing. I guess I'm making a phone call. When we put the majority of our weight on future proofing, it also comes out with Tim on top. Another thing that we did not consider when we were discussing these, and this was intentional because we did want to focus really on the ideas rather than the current political climate, is the political acceptability of these ideas. And of course, in the real policymaking world, this is incredibly important. And considering these three ideas against each other, we talked about it as a group, and we feel, again, that Tim's is probably the most politically acceptable. Our reasoning for this is because the idea that there is too much bureaucracy and there is too much red tape is a pretty easy idea for people to understand, both at the policymaking level, but also at the constituent level. So we feel that it'd be an easier thing to campaign and get people to agree to, but also because it's really the cheapest one to do, and we're in a deficit year. So it's going to be hard to go to the legislature and ask for more money right now. And so we feel, given that context, that Tim's really comes out on top. Keeping that in mind, we also have the recent article by Ezra Klein. It was an opinion article in the New York Times, where he wrote about the problem with everything bagel liberalism, which was a case study in San Francisco where a housing development was able to build a lot faster than all the other housing developments, specifically because they did not work with the state and federal money. And essentially, the everything bagel liberalism is this idea that regulatory burdens are holding us down. This opinion article was pretty well received, so we also think that this is another example that the idea that regulatory burdens need to be addressed makes Tim's idea pretty politically acceptable. Colin's idea of revving up funding, we also feel, is a very politically acceptable idea given the entire host of funding initiatives that already exist. There's clearly political will for creating these sorts of funding initiatives. And had we not been in a deficit year, we might have actually considered this one to be the most politically acceptable, just given all of the weight that's already behind infrastructure funding initiatives. And then lastly, we put Christine's at the third in our list of politically acceptable. Again, because of the deficit year, it's expensive, it's a lot of money up front, but also because it's very technical. And it would be really complicated to explain it not only to constituents, but also to the legislature and policymakers. And so you have a bit more of a hurdle in trying to get people on board with it. That being said, there's the Microgrid Initiative Program by the California Public Utilities Commission, which is actually a $30 million initiative that's set aside for people interested in building microgrids. So there is a lot of political will there as well, just not as much as the other two. That being said, this really isn't an either or problem. It's a both and. When we look at our problem tree again, I have this image up here of all the arrows in which our different solutions were impacting this problem, or impacting the causes of our problem, I should say. And you can see that once they're all added up, we're really addressing almost all of the problems causing all of the causes causing our problem. And the reason being is because there are regulatory burdens and they need to be addressed. And there are funding gaps and they need to be addressed, but none of that would matter if we don't also address the energy issues with trying to set up all of these charging stations. And so we don't feel our ideas work against each other. We feel they work in tandem. With that being said, are there any questions?
Was there a collective reason why you guys didn't mention the barrier of like the social dependence of fuel cars, and maybe that rural areas have a very low need for EV cars?
Yeah, so there are a lot of barriers to EV adoption. The reason we structured our entire presentation around EV infrastructure specifically is because we come from the mind frame that if we build it, they will come. Of all the other issues with EV adoption, like the high cost of EVs, the general cultural preference for gas-powered cars, the lack of EV options for people that need to tow things, right? So we have like the Rivian trucks, but there aren't that many truck options. All of these play a role in the idea of trying to get people to adopt EVs generally. But if we addressed all of that and didn't address the infrastructure issue, we still would not be able to raise demand for EVs, because ultimately you need to be able to charge your car. People are not going to buy into EVs if they feel like they're going to be stuck within a small range around their home.